was a typical Saturday night. Like most guys my age, I was standing in the center of my room, staring at the wall, trying to keep the dark thoughts out. Oh God, they're back. The medication isn't working. I can't live like this any longer. I've got to do something. I've got to enter my own mind, battle my way to the throne of the heart, and accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior.
For you are my life, my love, my God.
Okay, hang on. I bet you're wondering how the hell I even became aware of this game. I mean, if I was in a restaurant robbery gone wrong and Samuel L. Jackson was pointing a gun at my face and he said,
"You read the Bible, Ringo?"
my answer would have to be,
"Not regularly, no."
But when I was a kid, about 8 or 9, I had this friend, Josiah. He lived in a very Christian household. His family never pushed any of their beliefs on me, but definitely raised Josiah to be very involved with Christianity. There was this one time, I remember we were playing with Bionicles and there was a knock at the door. He got up and told me to wait. The man at the door was some kind of member of the church. He had Josiah list all the books of the Bible as some sort of test. Another time I slept over at Josiah's house and he was listening to some kind of Christian life coach on tape to help him sleep. Other than that, he was no different than any of my other friends really. But there was one thing that made his house feel different, and that was a lack of video games. The parents were fairly controlling when it came to the media Josiah could consume, so Saints of Virtue was one of the only games he had. Clearly, they didn't do any research about the game because despite having Christian themes, Saints of Virtue was far and away the most nightmare-inducing, screwed-up video game I had ever played. If the parents had seen even a few minutes of gameplay, I guarantee they would have taken that game away. The game proclaims to have no killing in it, but there are scarier things out there for a kid than blood and guns. Even as an adult, I'll randomly have nightmares about this game, or get a Vietnam flashback about a certain section.
The one with most toys win.
A lot of stuff in this game feels pretty unhinged. Like, there's this sign that tells you, don't jump, and in the background you hear these echoes of screaming voices jumping. Then you've got this room with televisions dancing, or some of these other rooms which really assault the senses. This room, filled with traps, practically looks like a torture chamber. Reminds me a lot of the Shadow Temple from Ocarina. Other stuff feels uncomfortable or lonely. They really evoke that feeling of liminal space, which, as I understand it, is a place that was normally filled with people and things that has since been abandoned, leading to this sense of unease. All of this stuff contrasts with the plucky attitude of the game's protagonist.
I wonder what that did.
I mean, this game is almost like Binding of Isaac, battling your sins and temptations, but unlike Isaac, whose life is a nightmare and who thinks of himself as evil or corrupt, this guy is putting on armor like a Saturday morning cartoon, proclaiming victory after each battle. So long, vanity! Also, this game has one of my favorite secret area sounds ever.
Oh yeah.
What's most intriguing to me about this game is just how much of a mystery it is. Almost nobody has even heard of this game, any knowledge about the game is limited, and the story behind it is unknown. This game is like the Majora's Mask bend-drowned creepypasta, except it actually existed. Every now and then, when I'm researching a video topic, I like to try to email developers, get their perspective, see if anything comes of it, and so far, nothing ever has. But if there was ever a time I'd hope to get some answers, this is it. And, to my surprise, I got a response from Mike Ulrich, the game's art director. He agreed to be interviewed, and then went above and beyond and sent me a bunch of sketches and game design documents he found in his office. I mean, this is the equivalent of seeing Bigfoot as a kid, and then 25 years later, he emails you his vacation photos.
I mean, this guy was a wild man, and he wanted to be a roommate. And I said, sure, I'm here in college and I'm here to have fun too. So we hooked up. Thing was, he got saved out of high school and went in with a group called InterVarsity and went on a trip to Mexico.
See you in a few months.
And came back a born again Christian, which I was kind of bummed about. It was going to ruin my whole time in college. We spent a lot of time talking about God, talking about religion, talking about those kinds of things. And somewhere in that process, I started to understand the difference between religion and relationship. I took that with me when I went into my professional career as an illustrator. And then as I started in game development, I did that for a few years, working with this company, doing all kinds of stuff. Worked through the NES for Nintendo, the Super NES, and PC games as an artist and animator. I always wondered why people weren't making faith-based games, or a game that that had some kind of Christian message to it. So I thought, hey, I'm gonna try to fill a gap here.
Turns out there were a lot more things that were intentional than I thought.
I never really thought of it as horror, but I thought of it as surreal. The masks of humanity, that's kind of what those were. We all wear masks that we put on. They're hollow, they're surface, they're a facade, and when you get behind them, they just disappear. So that seemed like a good metaphor to use for these carnal influences that we wrestle with inside. And as far as like the internal design of, like, say, the mall, well, all of them, understanding who you are and what makes you tick and all of those things, it's a very lonely process. It's you and your brain, So in that sense, it was very intentional that all of these locations are empty because they're all something that you fill. A lot of the structures that we tried to, I think, portray inside of this metaphorical world was, symbolic of the kinds of emptiness that we lead ourselves to by following after these ideas.
It was great having some of these questions about the game answered. Questions that I've asked myself, zoning out in the shower all those years. And I didn't know what to expect, but I found him to be a very friendly guy, very down to earth.
That's actually a painting I have in a drawer over here that I did in school.
You painted this?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And then I took a photo and then just image mapped it onto a frame. So, yeah.
And so a lot of this furniture is furniture you had at your place at the time.
Yeah, just something I could kind of model after. And when we say we did everything, we really actually did everything, including the box design and all the illustrations, the promo materials, the inserts. All of that was all stuff that we did.
I found it particularly funny that he does a podcast on unexplained mysteries and UFOs, not aware that from my point of view, the game he made was the unexplained mystery. We ended up talking for about 3 hours, and the time just flew by, and I'll have that full interview up on the Patreon. And I had such a good time that it pains me to say the following sentence. I cannot recommend Saints of Virtue. Despite some great atmosphere and interesting ideas, the game has not aged well, and even at the time had some major issues and bugs. For example, this area has like 6 or 7 critical keys and items, but you only have 3 inventory slots. If you pick up an item in the wrong order and put it back on the floor and then later the game crashes, that critical item is gone forever. And then there's this poison lake on the final level. You need to cross the lake to make progress, but it drains your health too quickly because the damage you take is tied to the frame rate. So the base game is unbeatable on modern machines. I played a fan patch of this game called Saints X that fixes these game-breaking scenarios and modernizes the controls, and even then, the game crashed on me several times while my character also gained no clip randomly a few times. I mean, hey, at least it made gathering footage a little easier. Even if you ignore all that and the game played perfectly, the game is still kind of a slog when it comes to backtracking. You can see, based on level maps like this, that key items needed to open doors are often placed on opposite ends of the map. If you're going in blind, you're guaranteed at some point to arrive at a door, not have what you need, and then wander aimlessly checking every nook and cranny until you find it. You can follow a guide, but this drains away much of the atmosphere and tension that makes the game interesting in the first place. To be fair, sometimes the backtracking and mindless wandering can add to the horror. Enemies don't respawn, so you can spend upwards of 20 to 30 minutes not seeing any, and almost forget they exist as you scrounge the level looking for items. Then, when you accidentally stumble into a room you haven't been to and a giant head assaults you, it can be really startling. I definitely jumped out of my chair a few times playing this just because I forgot about the enemies. Although really, I think this is less due to the lapse in action and more a testament to the enemy design being so striking. A lot of these issues came down to the engine they settled on when making the game.
We bankrolled it ourselves. David's dad put in a significant amount of money. I think it was about $60,000. My parents and some of my family put in probably close to $25,000. We started looking for game engines, and they were expensive. Because of the limitations of the engine, we kind of built the game around the capability that it had. Some of those long stretch out locations were simply a way for us to get into another loadable section where we had more textures and more sprites.
These guys didn't make their money back on this game, and dreams of a sequel were shelved. But hey, just because the game didn't find success then, doesn't mean all those ideas should be lost forever. Look at someone like Ryu. Ryu is considered by many to be the face of fighting games, but his first game, Street Fighter 1, is a terrible, terrible game, with 1 or 2 innovations. Capcom took those innovations, gave them a second chance, and created some of the most beloved fighting games of all time. Now, there is a community of people out there who are interested in making some sort of sequel or a spiritual successor, no pun intended.
As far as the sequel goes, I mean, I would love to see it. I guess our prayer when we made it is that it touched lives, that maybe it would help somebody along the way, or give somebody an idea, or if nothing else, just entertain kids in a way that maybe is safe. So as far as like people picking it up and wanting to run with it, I've been very open to that.
Okay, so what could a Saints of Virtue sequel look like? From a philosophy perspective, I think of something like the Talos Principle. Like Saints of Virtue, the game takes place entirely in the main character's mind, although each game's objectives are complete opposites of each other. In Saints of Virtue, the goal of the game is to destroy the image of yourself and put God in charge. In Talos, your mind is a sort of Garden of Eden, and your goal is to ignore the game's voice of God and leave that paradise.
What have you done? Why have you ascended the tower? Why have you betrayed my faith in you?
One thing Talos does that I really like is it doesn't lock the player into any one philosophy. It presents a bunch of various concepts and allows the player to draw their own conclusions. It even allows the player to reject the serpent's knowledge. With Saints of Virtue, pretty much every interaction is based around accepting Jesus into your heart. Since that's what Mike defines a Saint of Virtue to be, it makes sense that that's what you're doing.
Saint of Virtue is just basically the process of sanctification on a person who believes. So that's kind of what
the accepting Jesus into your heart thing.
Yeah. So and not just saying a prayer like, "Oh Jesus, yeah, I believe in you," kind of thing. But the process of sanctification is something more. It's where you basically die to yourself and you live for him.
Even so, I think if a Saints of Virtue sequel was going to be mainstream and successful, it should consider allowing the player to draw their own conclusions. If accepting Jesus into your heart is truly enticing, the player should choose to make that decision themselves instead of being forced to do it just to get an ending. Any philosophy game, regardless of intent, with only one right way forward, can come off as preachy.
Hey,
Have you heard the good news?
we met Thanksgiving.
However, this is all assuming that this kid is a stand-in for the player. If the player was playing as a character, you could be more rigid with the philosophy if you wanted because you're role-playing and acting out a story. What if there was a Sopranos game where you entered the mind of Tony Soprano and you were tasked with navigating Tony's various dreams? Maybe you disagree with the philosophies and decisions of Tony Soprano, but it's okay because you're playing a character. You can still draw your own conclusions through his story. You could do the same thing with a Christian kid going through a spiritual journey. If he's a character with a story to tell, maybe it could work. I don't know. Anyway, $4 a pound. I'm more interested in the gameplay side of how a Saints of Virtue 2 might look than the philosophy side. And with that, I really have just 2 major gameplay critiques I'd like to bring up. First, keep the items in a tighter space, make the levels smaller, and have fewer mazes. I mean, I really can't stress how bad some of this backtracking can be at certain points in the game. Take a puzzle game like Portal 2. The designers were very careful about making relevant puzzle information fresh in the player's mind, often keeping elements from a single puzzle only a room or two away from each other. Saints of Virtue is pretty naturally split up into zones due to the engine's texture loading restrictions, but the vast majority of items are matched with other zones, leading to a lot of running back and forth. For example, there's a moment here where you have to throw a pipe to stop a ceiling from falling, but the pipe is found in a totally different area. If you missed the pipe, you have to backtrack, but more importantly, it's unclear what the pipe even does because you picked it up so long ago. When are you meant to use it? It could just as easily be used in a different type of puzzle, like to make some sort of connection complete in a series of pipes or something. If the pipe is meant to be used for such a specific purpose, it really should be in the same zone as the puzzle that requires it. The other aspect of this backtracking critique is just how many mazes there are. I actually really like some of the maze ideas in this game, and I think they're all pretty visually distinct. The problem is, they all happen in the same level, one after the other. You could serve me the biggest, best steak in the world, but if you force me to eat 7 of them in one sitting, I'll have a very different opinion on them. Spreading them out more evenly over the whole game, or maybe making some of them optional with character upgrades as rewards, could help them stand out more and fatigue the player less. Second critique, make the game either more like Doom or nothing like Doom. In Doom-style games, you have a wide variety of weapons, and you're thrown into tons of different types of combat scenarios with monsters. There's just a greater variety in the enemy types, the number of enemies, the locations of the enemies, and so on.
Enemies that you battled are themed specifically for that level.
And, that's a totally fair way to design it thematically. But the gameplay outcome was more repetitive than it had to be. On top of that, the player generally had just the sword, with 1 or 2 other weapons like a double-barreled sword or a rocket launcher sword, which is pretty cool, but, if you want to have weapons and combat at all, make new weapons that are easier to find and give the player more scenarios they can be used. If you don't want to lean into the combat and introduce more variety, then it should be removed entirely. Instead, create a full-on surrealist puzzle game like Antechamber. There are several moments in Saints of Virtue that remind me a lot of Antechamber, like this sign maze where you have to follow only certain instructions, or this part where you have to intentionally jump into this pit to create a change in the level. A lot of stuff like this is pretty abstract and open for interpretation, and I think making a game like this could open up some interesting philosophical level design. Something that Antechamber kind of already does with its signage. There's another way you could go as well, and that's full-on horror game. Remove the combat and make it a game of cat and mouse. In this version of the game, you can't ever truly erase these bad things from your mind, you can only stop them from overwhelming and destroying you. Take gameplay cues from horror games like Phasmophobia, where you're using items and solving a mystery while under the threat of a force you can't kill. Maybe give the player a cross that stuns enemies and gives you a chance to escape. That seems more on brand than a sword.
The power of Christ compels you!
Oh, does it? Does it compel me?
I want to stress that I don't mean to take shots at the developers here with these suggestions. Saints of Virtue was a passion project, made 25 years ago by 2 people, during a time when game development tools were in their infancy and constantly changing. I mean, I know I would not have been able to make a better game at that time. But thankfully, those primitive days are done. It's a new era of game design. There are so many great engines out there available for free, indie gaming is flourishing, and the collective knowledge of game designers is at an all-time high. If there are people truly interested in making a Saints of Virtue sequel or remake or whatever, there's never been a better time to fully realize that original vision.
We figure, and I know Dave feels the same way, it's God's thing. If he wants to do something with it, that'd be awesome. I have other irons in the fire, so if somebody else has got that desire, and I'll be their cheerleader and help in any way I can.
You can be my cheerleader by liking and subscribing. I'm a small part-time creator who would love to have more time in the day to make videos. Liking, subscribing, and sharing helps me to do that. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on Saints of Virtue and ideas for a sequel in the comments below. Lastly, a huge thanks to this month's patrons who helped make this video possible. Sign up to watch the full interview with Mike Ulrich, where he talks about the game, his career in games, and a whole bunch of other stuff I had no idea about. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
And I forgot all about this. So I'd made this probably in 1988, and it's made out of cast bronze. But I never really made the correlation that these guys showed up in that game. But that's really weird.